a great privilege for me to have the opportunity to be a colleague of Miriam Krupka's, and having been someone that over these past few years, having had the opportunity to bring her to different communities. She is someone who is so talented in not just teaching Torah and sharing her knowledge and her thought, but really bringing a generation of students, immersing them in Torah learning in a way that makes them feel engaged and to fall in love with learning Torah, and really inspires them to move forward. And that's really one of the many talents that Miriam Krupka has. Today, she serves as the Dean of Faculty at Ramaz, and we are so privileged to have it, because what she does is she inspires the other professionals to love to teach, not just love their students, but just the art of teaching. And it's an amazing thing to watch her and to watch the work that she's done with them. Her role in her Judaic studies is that she helps to shape all of the curriculum in the school. And again, it's really enhanced everything that we do at Ramaz. For those that know what's going on today, or know or understand the things that are happening, it is amazing that we've moved far forward in so many areas with technology, but not just that, just even meeting our students where they're at. Miriam has her MA in Jewish philosophy from Columbia University, where her thesis work focused on messianic writings of Isaac Abarbanel. She lectures all over, so we're privileged that she actually, as she told us, only said yes to Ramaz because she's working tirelessly to make sure that school can open in September with as many of our students as possible there.
I literally turned down all your requests.
I know. She's, by the way, other than taking down the walls themselves, she's been involved in every other aspect of it, and maybe even she's helped to take down some walls. So I thank you, Miriam. What I didn't say, which I always like to begin with, is that we continue to stand together with our community during this very difficult time period, and know that there continue to be many people who continue to suffer with corona and other illnesses, and we wish them a refuah shlema, and in the zechut of the Torah that will be learned here this evening, that Miriam will teach, and all of our thoughts and prayers during this time period for the Jewish people, we will have in mind all of those people for the refuah, and for those who have lost loved ones during this difficult time period. We stand with you. This community stands very strongly as a family. Our latest tragedy that we just heard about was Mr. David Quint, a real amazing man, the father of Yossi Quint, a graduate of Ramaz, and he passed away earlier today and is going to have his burial in Israel tomorrow. So we send the family our condolences, and our thoughts are with them as well. And on a happy note, we wish everybody a wonderful Shabbat to come, and I thank you all for being on with us this evening. At the bottom of your screens, there's a Q&A button. Miriam is a very interactive teacher, as I'm sure she will tell you, and there are many questions that come up, and I will make sure that she sees the questions and will answer as many of those questions as possible, either during or after her class concludes. Miriam, thank you for spending the time with us this evening, and thank you for all that you do for Ramaz and for the community. Take it away, Miriam.
So my pleasure. And I definitely, like, when I heard this was a webinar and not a Zoom interactive, I said to Kenny, and this holds, put something in the Q&A, and Kenny will be watching it. And I'd love for him to pass me those questions while this is going on, so I can deal with the questions as they come in, and if not, we'll do some at the end. Thank you everyone for being here. It is amazing to see some of the alumni names on this list. Would love to hear from you guys personally how you're doing. I want to recognize some of my colleagues who are here. I'm very humbled to be talking about the idea of space with Ms. Rabhan here. I know that I'm definitely going to have good discussions with her when this is over about the philosophical use of space and its connection to kind of the artistic structural use of space, which we've talked about before. So I'm happy to see her and some of my other colleagues. And of course, I see Rabbi Luxstein on the list, and I'm very humbled to be teaching Torah in front of my mentor and Mora Da'atra. So welcome everybody who is here. Let's jump right in. When I think of the idea of space or how we use space, the first thing that comes to my mind is like HGTV, right? Like, what are we doing with this space? What can this space be? What is its functionality? How do I make it home? And while I'm the first to admit that the hours I spend watching Trading Spaces or Love It or List It are probably a waste of time, I do think the concept of how we see space is important, not just functionally, but of course, philosophically. And I especially think it's important for us to think about this because as a diaspora community, or or maybe because culturally, which we'll get into, I think we have an easier time conceptualizing the sacredness of time than we do the sacredness of space. We give more weight to the idea of sacred time than sacred space. And we'll talk more about this, but think about like you wake up on the morning of your birthday and it feels different. We understand the feel of a different kind of time. I don't think as human beings, we're as good about feeling a different kind of space. And, you know, we might conceptualize that a bit with Israel, but we're going to talk a little bit about that. And this is the notion that in the description I sent, Abraham Joshua Heschel was very often the person who was the holy time versus holy space guy. And interestingly enough, there were those that accused him of being not Zionistic enough because of his focus on time rather than space. He was trying to desacredize space, they felt, in order to make the idea of the Holy Land less important than the idea of holy time, like the Sabbath. So those are kind of, he becomes kind of the person who popularized that idea in some way. So let's start a little bit with this idea. Sociologists have long studied the idea of space as not merely geographical or cultural, but as one of human experience. So let me explain for a minute. So those of you native French speakers out there will probably cringe at the way I butcher his name, but Henri Lefebvre, who's a well-known French sociologist, talks about 3 kinds of space. Okay, so let's introduce with this and then we'll move to the Tanakh. The first is what he calls perceived space. Now, perceived space is the mere materiality of space. This is a 5 by 4, let's say, inch box. You are all sitting in a room. Its measurements are X by Y. It can hold a certain amount of people. I've been doing that for the last 3 weeks, walking through Ramaz. These are the measurements of this room. Here's 6 feet difference. Here's how many people we can fit. And this can be, it's more than just the mere materiality of space. It can bring into account things like urban planning, how you use space, etc. Then we have something called conceived space. Now, conceived space is space that is the social process, that is the result of a social process of planning, naming, and inscribing significance. So for instance, this space is not just X feet by X feet, it is the auditorium of the Ramaz upper school. The same exact size geographical square of space 2 blocks over might be a bike path or Central Park. In our example here on the screen, the same 5 by 4 space is no longer just a space, it is a living room, right? So a space with loud noises or loud colors is one type of conceived space. The exact same X by Y feet of space can be a more relaxing space if it has tranquil music, right? So that's conceived space. But Lefebvre, I think we can easily recognize the difference between 1 and 2. But his third category of space is something that he calls lived space. And lived space is when space becomes subjective, when it produces a meaning to you that is nonverbal, but is experiential only. The exact same space, the same living room, so not X by Y feet, but the living room, the same space can be scary to you because you experience something fearful there. And it can be something wonderful to me because I had a certain experience there that was different. So people sometimes talk about lived space as it's not what you bring to that, it's what you bring to the space, not what the space brings to you. So that's what lived space is. So in our example here, X by Y feet is perceived space. A living room, a tranquil, lovely, colored living room is conceived space. And this is my living room. So that's a picture of my kids. So if I show you a picture of my kids in a living room, now it's my living room. So that's different than the same living room in the same feet of space that is somebody else's living room, because I walk in there and it's my TV, my couch, my place where I spend my memories. And that's what lived space is, okay? So keep these 3 kind of categories in mind, because that's going to be important as we talk about the idea of lived space, often called sacred space. There's an emotional reality to those spaces. It's what you bring to the space, not necessarily what the space is bringing to you. And often it's nonverbal, right? Like I can't tell you, oh, it's a living room, or it just is. It's a feeling. It's something you feel when you walk into a particular space. So what I want to do is take a look at 2 very significant descriptions of spaces in Tanakh. One of them opens Tanakh and one of them closes it. So Eden, Gane Den, is the opening story in many ways of Tanakh. And if you think about it, creation, the idea of the creation of space and time are the stories of creation. So God creates this space, this beautiful, ideal, utopian space, and it's the story of mankind's exile from that space. The same story or a similar story is what closes the canon. What closes the canon is the idea of the exile from Jerusalem, the destruction, the leaving of a space, and both of them have what to say about identity. What happens to identity when we move from one space to another? Eden, I think the story is happening on a very philosophical level, right? Like it's a story about the nature of humanity. It doesn't really matter if Adam and Eve were real or not real. It's kind of some sort of conceptual, philosophical, psychological story. And Jerusalem is clearly a story about a place that had political, social, cultural significance. It was real, and it's about a nationality, a political entity, a religious entity moving from one space to another. So I think being as these are two stories of spaces and our identities, and they're the bookends really of Tanakh, they're interesting to talk about, especially given that it's the 3 weeks and we are the 9 days, and we're focusing very much now on the idea of a lost space. That was very significant to us as a nation and as a culture. And I also think the idea of space, and it's interesting because Ms. Rabin and I have been having this conversation over the last few weeks, the idea of space now, in the reality of the last 4 or 5 months, has also become a very interesting discussion, psychologically, sociologically, right? Like culturally, like what is the space of a classroom when it's on Zoom and we're not in the same space? Why are we so desperate to be back live? What happens when I'm not sitting next to you in a classroom, but I'm sitting 6 feet apart from you, right? Like what happens to the room? So this whole idea of space on a million different levels has become so significant in our lives in so many ways. So let's start. Let's start with Gane Den. What kind of space was it? Was it an ideal space? Is it real? Let's start with that clearly. Okay, so, okay, we'll come back to this in a minute. This is just descriptions, by the way, of what can make a space a lived or sacred space. Sociologists and historians often point to 3 things. A space can be considered sacred if the function, let's say the Beit HaMikdash, is something important to you. The history of a place can make it sacred. So I might visit the Arc de Triomphe and it means nothing to me. I'm like, oh, nice space. But Dr. Jacoby visits it, and because he knows everything about the history of it, it feels more sacred to him. Again, it's what he brings to the space, what I bring to the space, my knowledge, my experience. And finally, let's say a cemetery is sometimes called sacred space because of the emotional relevance, right? I walk in and I understand what this space is and what it means. So these are just 3 categories of what can make something into a sacred space, meaning it's not just X by Y cemetery, it's X by Y cemetery that I bring meaning to if someone I know is there, or I know the history of the wars of the soldiers who are here. So that's kind of 3 different categories that can create that space. So let's take a look at Eden for a minute, okay? Here's the basic description of the creation of not just Adam and Chava, the first man and woman, but also the idea that they were placed in a certain space, right? So Pasuk Chet, Vayita Hashem Elokim Gane Den Mikedem, Vayasem Shem et Ha'adam asher yatzar. So the first thing we find out is humanity is created and they are placed in a space. And then we get this extensive geographical description of this place, right? It's that God planted this garden and that God caused all these amazing things to grow from this garden. And there's descriptions of the 4 different rivers. And if you look at Yud Bet, Uzahav Ha'aretz Hahu, Tov, Sham HaBedolach, Ve'evan HaShoam, right? There's a beautiful description of just the gold and the stones and the beauty of the land. And then the rivers which flowed, and it gives you the map almost, like you could picture the east and the west river, etc. And we're given this kind of geographical description. Now, here's what's interesting about the description of Gane Den. Gane Den is clearly a space that is something called a locus aminis, which is an idealized space of safety or comfort in literature. And what a locus aminis is, it usually has 3 basic elements: trees, grass, and water. Often it's in some sort of remote place. It functions as like this beautiful landscape of the mind where you can relax. There's a utopian nature to it, which we'll talk about in a minute. And it's often used, a locus aminis is usually used to highlight the difference between urban life and rural life, right? That there's this beauty of rural life. It's a place of refuge from the processes of time and mortality. Life in its worst political circumstances and corruption does not take place. It's just this place of beauty. And as soon as humanity is corrupted by making a mistake and by doing what they were not supposed to do, they're banished from the garden of beauty. They can no longer be in this beautiful space. And we can give many, many examples from literature where the idea of the rural beauty or the bucolic nature of a space is used in comparison to kind of the corruption of city life, right? This is the perfect place. It is love, it's fertility, it's nature, it's free of political corruption. And then it's kind of the pastoral idea versus the city idea. And those of you who've been in my Megillot class know that we've talked about this a lot, especially when we compare the Megillot of Ruth and Esther. Ruth is a very pastoral narrative. Esther is a very urban narrative. It takes place completely within the city walls. Now, I want to talk about the pastoral and the urban just for a minute, because if you think about the opening, right, of Tanakh with this beautiful kind of idyllic image of the pastoral, well, the opposite of that is Jerusalem. Right? I mean, when it comes to descriptions of Jerusalem in Tanakh, it's a city. There are city walls, there are kings, there are processes, there are politics, there is corruption. And what's really interesting about all of Tanakh, which we do not have time to get into at all, is that almost every story in Tanakh that has to do with corruption or evil has to do with the city and city walls. And almost every story of kind of like beauty and growth and this idea of the contemplative life, the natural life, the shepherd image, the idea of the corrupted city life versus the beautiful country life is kind of all over Tanakh. So think of a couple of examples, right? Not just Esther and Ruth. And by the way, very often these two kinds of images, right, the bucolic, beautiful natural space and the corrupted city space, are used as a criticism of political life, right? It's often used as a as the idea of rural harmony contrasted with the corruption of the city life. So think about Moshe in Mitzrayim. Paro, it's corrupt and he's being told on this, and he runs away to be a shepherd and live out in the countryside. Right? Shaul's corruption of David. David runs out to the field. That's where he finds his harmony. Achav, right? And the vineyard, the Kerem of Navod. Achav is the awful king. He walks out. He wants to conquer the simple, lovely vineyard of the simple, lovely person who it's his Nachalai doesn't belong. The very first thing humanity does when they leave Gane Den is they start to build cities. Right? That's what we do when we can no longer have the satisfaction or the calm or the beauty, and when mankind becomes corrupt. Migdal Bavel, right? The very first city that is built in Tanakh is this massive sin that was not supposed to happen, etc. So you really see kind of a lot of this idea. It's called the pastoral genre. Shakespeare uses it a ton. So you can see it all over Shakespeare. So this is kind of an example from one of my favorite Shakespeare works, As You Like It. It's a very good example. The court people here are seeking refuge in rural life. So they go out to the forest of Arden, where things are full of possibilities. The court is full of corruption and stagnation. Oliver's controlling Orlando, etc. And Orlando and Rosalind can only fall in love in the countryside. There are endless possibilities. Once they're in the countryside, they're always singing and dancing, right? And it's beautiful. And you really see this kind of all over literature. Dystopian works are usually about, have settings that are no longer in contact with nature, or they're fully controlling nature. It's like a subversion of freedom or possibility. So think like Huxley's Brave New World or Orwell's 1984. Even The Hunger Games plays on this theme a lot, right? The corruption of nature by the city people and how they're using it. The language of Tanakh, when it uses pastoral language, is usually in its most beautiful pieces. So Mashal HaKerem, right? The parable of the vineyard and God's love for his people, Shir HaShirim, right? Most of the more negative stories occur in the city or the court. And the largest chunks, as I said, of non-pastoral descriptions in Tanakh are usually a foreshadowing for something negative. Bad things happen in the walls of the city. Eicha has a lot of city imagery, destruction, corruption, etc. And it's a decidedly kind of, and so when we look at these two stories, we see that Gane Den is a very pastoral narrative and Jerusalem is a very city one. And what's really interesting is that when we get into the passages in Tanakh that talk about the rebuilding of the city, the rebuilding of Jerusalem, so if we go into kind of the Messianic era, right? The descriptions of how Jerusalem will be built. There are very few descriptions of how the city will be rebuilt, and the descriptions are actually decidedly pastoral. So here's a good example. There's a ton of passages like this in Tanakh, right? Where we're talking about the building of the city. So Uzziah is this amazing king. He built towers and gates, and there's all these descriptions of the way that he rebuilt the city, the structure of the city, and it's all foreshadowing for Uzziah's fall, right? Because The more that he was able to build up the city to be something wonderful and strong, the more, haughty he got. And that was the foreshadowing to his downfall. And you see that a lot. And then what's really interesting, though, and this we all did in 10th grade or 11th grade or 9th grade Navi, wherever it was on the curriculum when you attended Ramaz, but you all did this, whether you remember it or not, which is that when we talk about the rebuilding of Jerusalem, we switch back into pastoral language, right? Yeah, there are some descriptions of the city being rebuilt, but the chunk of the descriptions utilize pastoral language, right? So, think about some of the famous categories here, right? Pasuk Daled and Perek Bet, right? What will happen to the spears and the swords? They will become farming tools. We'll go back to being farmers. We'll go back to being people who are connected to the land, right? And then if you look at Perek Yud Aleph, the other kind of famous parak about Acharit Hayamim and the utopian, beautiful, idyllic, pastoral, messianic era, the city is not being described as a city. We get all these kind of very natural descriptions. Even the king, the political king of Mashiach, is called the Yatza Choter Migeza Yishai, right? He's a shoot coming out of the twigs and the trees of Yishai. All the rebirth and the regrowth description is using natural language, right? So with all that there, right, then we're kind of left with this kind of question of what was Eden supposed to represent, because it seems to be a far more idyllic, perfect, beautiful place than Jerusalem was. And is Jerusalem in its future and its rebuilding supposed to be kind of like Eden? And if so, then why is it that we're yearning to go back to Jerusalem? Let's just yearn to go back to Gane Den. Like, why don't we have a goal to get life, humanity, people, human interactions, the social justice of our world back to a place like Gane Den, rather to back to a place like Jerusalem? If Jerusalem was a city that, from everything we know about in Tanakh, was deeply flawed, right? I mean, all of Tanakh, right, is the failure of the political structures of Jerusalem and the social structures that existed within the city. And if Tanakh seems so emphatically dependent and focused on this idea of the idyllic and the natural and the pastoral and the field being the place where humanity is best able to engage with each other and with its potential, then why is it that Eden is not a place that we're looking to go back to? In fact, it seems like we've permanently left it for whatever reason and have no desire to return to it. And the desire to return to Jerusalem is something that we very much want, we very much focus on. So, Kenny, I'm going to pause for 1 second just in case there are any questions in the chat up until now that you want me to look at or focus on.
Only people asking, this is being recorded to make sure that they can share it with other people. Right now, I think everybody's just loving what you're teaching.
Okay, so then let's go back into this. Okay, so we are going to acknowledge going forward, right, that obviously Jerusalem is a place that is real, right? Government, war, politics, reality is going to exist. And we're going to operate on the assumption that the goal is to somehow combine that, right, with peace, happiness, and security in a way that is idyllic and utopian, right? We want the future Jerusalem. We want the Messianic era. Prophetic Messianism is, in my opinion, the earliest form of utopian writing, which anyone who's taken my class has known that I love to talk about this, right? We're setting up this utopian ideal, right? A world that we all want to be in, a world with no war, perfect peace, lots of money, all the things that are in our national or personal utopias. And we're setting that up as a form of I always say prophetic messianism is the earliest form of utopian writing, right? So if that's the case, and we're going to come back to the space thing, don't worry, we're not leaving it behind, then what we really need to talk about, we need to start with the idea of what the purpose of utopian writing was, why prophetic messianism is similar but very different to utopian writing. And one of the major differences is the idea of a concrete space, a space that exists, right? Because many utopian writings, as you're going to see in a minute, in fact, the actual word utopia means no place. It means it's a place that doesn't really exist. It's not here. We're using it as this ideal to work towards and making our place a better place. But the major difference between utopian writing and prophetic messianism, the idea of what Jerusalem can be in the future, is that we're using a historical typology. We're taking a place that actually existed, that was terrible, that was flawed, that in many ways, while it was also very holy and wonderful, had a lot of problems, and we're using that to craft utopia. So let's start with just a little bit of what utopian literature was and when it started. And I think from that comparison, I think we'll have a very deep appreciation for what it is we are yearning towards when we look towards the return to Jerusalem. Okay, so let's start here. Here's a favorite piece of mine, a book that I think I had Dr. Jacoby read when he started teaching his space and civilizations class, because there's, and he also teaches a utopian class. Sharing an office with him is a lot of fun. So it's called Idea of Progress. It's a small little book, James Bury. And in the book, what he talks about, which is very interesting, is he points out that utopian literature really came into being when humanity began to believe in the idea of progress and perfectibility, right? So it used to be that most of society lived in an eat to live mentality, right? Getting to the next day was all the future you could see. And it was only when people began to think about bigger ideas like equality, economic equitability, and nationalism, right, that Bury points out that in most systems of ancient thought, time was considered the enemy of humanity. Change meant corruption and disaster, right? Like the idea of Greek philosophical thinkers used to think of time as immutable because any form of change was viewed negatively, right? The gods created space and time to look like this, and humanity is not supposed to change it. But as society started thinking about not just the future of tomorrow, but a future of next week or next month or next year or 20 years from now, right? The idea of thinking, where can I be 20 years from now? Where can the nation or society be 20 years from now? And what changes can we make now to get there? That's a modern idea, right? Like that wasn't something that was thought of as much. And there are many reasons given for that. Bury talks about poverty, lack of knowledge, the universe, lack of hope, feeling like things couldn't change. Again, the idea that the divine beings made the world the way it is and we can't do anything about it. And he talks about that here. Aristotle, considering the subject from a practical point of view, laid down that changes in an established social order undesirable, should be as few and slight as possible. This prejudice against change excluded the apprehension of civilization as a progressive movement. It did not occur to Plato or anyone else that a perfect order might be attainable by a long series of change and adaptations. Time was regarded as the enemy of humanity. It was this order which kept things in their places, assigned to each its proper sphere and function, and drew a definite line, for instance, between men and gods. Human progress towards perfection, towards an ideal of omniscience or an ideal of happiness, would have been breaking down the bars which divide the human from the divine. So only when we got to a point where humanity could start thinking about the far future, that's when utopian literature could start to be written. Because the purpose of utopian literature, if you think even about kind of the famous work, Utopia, right? It wasn't just, oh, let's get a break from our terrible lives by thinking about the beauty of a perfect world. They were written as social criticisms, right? We're going to take something we think is wrong in today's world, poverty, and we'll talk about a world, right, that has no poverty, to encourage the societies who are reading this book to think about what they can do or how they can make change to work towards that world. And now here's what's interesting. This is something the Nevi'im in ancient biblical history understood for a long time, before the 1850s. They understood that human relations and society could be improved over a long period of time, that personal and national status or character are not predetermined or unchangeable constructs, right? And indeed, by describing the Messianic world as Acharit Hayamim, the end of days, right? Yeshayahu is proposing and championing the idea that change can and must happen, even if it requires an extended period of time. So all of Messianic prophecy functions with an eye towards the far future, right? A concept that really first gains traction in like the 16th century, right? That focused on the idea of existence and progress more than just daily survival. So that's really kind of amazing, right? And this is just kind of a piece from the Utopia Reader introduction, because again, this idea of utopia is no place. So the primary characteristic of the utopia is non-existence, right? It's about the beauty of the utopia is that it's not a world that doesn't exist, but it's a world that isn't supposed to exist, because it's a world that's just supposed to inform the way I interact with my world here and now, right? So what's interesting then, if you look at Gane Den and Jerusalem, Gane Den is a bygone utopia, right? We didn't gain Gane Den with any human effort, right? And it's some sort of divine gift that was given to us for some reason, and it is supposed to be untenable. Now we can get into the idea philosophically of why Gane Den is untenable, and it's not a place that we need to go back to or understand, right? But it's not. It's a place that is far more utopian in its non-existence than Jerusalem, because what Jerusalem is, right, is a place that is focused on the fulfillment of some sort of destiny, but based in the idea of a national history. It is a place that actually exists. It exists throughout all of Tanakh, and the utopia that we're constructing is about returning to a place that actually existed, right? And this is actually kind of really interesting because utopias, by their very definition, prefer to remain aterritorial, right? They want to remain social commentaries on human characteristics, and prophetic messianism is one of the few utopias that's actually tied to a specific historical location, right? The idea of where we want to go is about rebuilding a vision of the past, of a place that we were. Right? It is not an envisioned space that only exists in our minds. It is a space that very much existed in history. And the utopia that we're building is not a building, it's a rebuilding. It's coming back to something that we were. It is something that we are bringing to the space that we are building. And that's one of the ways that it is sacred, because it's not just, and think about kind of the Uganda, discussions that took place under Herzl. One of the idea of we want to go to a place that was is because sacred space is the history, the thoughts, the experience we bring to a space, right? And what's really interesting is that this idea of a historically significant land, a dynastic king, a rebuilt temple, a promise, a 24-book canon promise that is being fulfilled, a national mission coming to fruition. Everything about the construction of a Jewish utopia is based in the past. It's based in a historical reality and memory, because the Nevi'im understood that a mission must rely on a greater narrative and history in order for the dream to feel tangible, powerful, and achievable, right? The biblical idea of zicharon, shared collective memory, is the guidepost that drives how a community works towards a desired future. If you're writing a utopia as a social criticism, and the Nevi'im were definitely writing their messianic writings as a social criticism, you can only make change, right, if the idea of change feels tangible. So it's based in something that we know and that we are. And in contrast, interestingly enough, utopian literature are sometimes criticized for being anti-nationalist, in that they champion the collapse of the Western world and its heritage. So Thomas More himself probed at some of these ideas in Utopia when he mocks those who fall back on the argument of tradition in order to justify weak character. So he says, it's like a beautiful quote, he says, failing all else, their last resort will be, if this was good enough for our ancestors, who are we to question their wisdom? Then they'll settle back in their chairs with an air of having said the last word on the subject, as if it would be a major disaster for anyone to be caught being wiser than their ancestors. So unlike the historical dependency of our return to Jerusalem and our utopian vision, More and many utopian works focused on a break from the past as an element of building utopia. The only way you can build a new and better world is if we get rid of as much as we can, right? And he builds his own utopia in an island, right, that the founder of utopia has cut off from the rest of mankind. We need to leave the ugly negativity of the politics of this world behind, and the social structures of this world behind, and build a perfect, idyllic new world that is not about our ancestors and our traditions and our history, right? So what's interesting is that by focusing on a historical reality and an actual land, we are reminded that prophetic utopia is a place that exists, and therefore is one that we can visit, we can settle, we can develop, that we are on a constant development cycle to make this space into something new. Not what it was, because what it was in many ways was flawed, but a rebuilding a concrete material geographical space that we rebuild by bringing to it certain things and making it better. And that's why Jerusalem cannot be Gane Den. Jerusalem has to have politics and a king and a structure and a government, because it's a real place. It's a place that even in the future is going to be flawed. It is not a Garden of Eden. It is not a Forest of Arden. It is not a perfect place where all the singing and dancing and beauty can come. It is going to be a real place with human people in it and human flaws. But we can make it more susceptible to human control. We can bring to it the experience of the flaws that we experience there. And that's why the language surrounding the rebuilding of a very real city is very natural and bucolic and idyllic and pastoral. Let's bring as much of the pastoral and the idealism of the natural world that we can bring to a very real place, a place that has existed in history, exists now, and that we are working on now. It's interesting, the social psychologist Eric Fromm talks about horizontal concerns and vertical concerns. So horizontal concerns are concerns that relate to the world around us, that occur within history and time. Vertical concerns are concerns that focus on the world outside of our tangible reach. So let's say like our tradition of the world to come or Christianity's kingdom of heaven. Those are vertical concerns. They don't necessarily have to do with this world. They're about when we leave this world. But the beauty of prophetic messianism, as it's presented in the text of Yeshayahu and Yecheskel, is that it's very much a horizontal concern. It doesn't rely on heavenly beings or non-corporeal entities or angels, or it includes a king, a land, and a political vision. It is a horizontal concern, right? The context, I think, of Yeshayahu also focuses very much on the idea of, and this is an argument in Jewish philosophy, are we an attitude of doing or an attitude of waiting, right? Are we just waiting for the Messianic era to drop on us? Will Jerusalem and the new temple land on us one day? Or is it about the development of a space that is dependent on us? And if you think about kind of the Zionist narratives that very much believe in the latter, right? Like we get towards, right? The beginning of Zion is the work that we do in Jerusalem now, right? So it's the idea of how do you build your utopian universe by working on it now, which is how prophetic messianism is similar to utopian literature, right? These utopian works were written in order to criticize and motivate society to change the things that were wrong with it. So prophetic messianism does the same thing. And I think it is amazing and incredible that we live in a world where we're seeing that happen. We're seeing the development, this horizontal concern, the development of this political space that in many ways is not idyllic and not bucolic and not pastoral, but we are rebuilding it, not just the rebuilding of the cities, but the rebuilding of the pastoral side of it as well. So the idea that Jerusalem is a space that represents the idea that utopias can be real, progress can be real, hope and change are real, and Gane Den's reality is not essential to its understanding. You don't have to believe that Gane Den was or wasn't a real place in order to understand what the story is supposed to mean, right? It's just setting up of an ideal. Jerusalem is the lived ideal. I can go on for a long time, which I won't, about how both are essential to education, right? Talking about a lived ideal and also talking about an ideal that is not real in any way or isn't supposed to be real in order for me to learn from it. It's a little similar. Leah, I feel like you want to say something.
Oh, there's just a question that came in that actually kind of complements your point. Someone wrote in, and I would have just sort of typed pieces of it to you, but it just was crafted so beautifully, and so I didn't want to cut it up, and so I'll just read it to you. So the question is, in his book Mimesis, I hope I said that correctly, Complet Professor Eric Auerbach discusses the Akedah. One of the things he points out is that the Torah, unlike in a Homeric epic, physical space is somewhat irrelevant. When Abraham says Hineni, it's not a physical here, but a mental one. Right. We don't get a physical description. Is it possible that we used to have a sacred physical space, for instance, Gane Den, and now only have access to a sacred mental space? Are utopias sacred physical spaces or mental ones, or is this too simplistic?
But I don't think that's simplistic. I think that's beautiful, and I think it highlights the point of Eden and Jerusalem, which is that there are concepts in the Torah of a sacred space that is not actual physical space, right? So let's say Gane Den, or the idea of Hineni, I am here, and yet there's also so much, I would say even far more, that also focuses on the idea of a physical space being sacred. So you have both, right? And it's really interesting because I had this discussion once with a couple of the English teachers, and they brought up the literary idea of verisimilitude. So what verisimilitude is, that on an emotional level, to really know something or connect to something, I may need a fictional account of it. So it's the idea that fictions can reveal truths that non-fictions cannot, that reality obscures. So what would affect you more? Reading like kind of a news article about a refugee camp, or maybe a really beautifully written historical fiction novel about a 12-year-old orphan boy struggling to live in a refugee camp? So the idea that there are stories that are about very real places, right? Even when Abraham says Hineni, it's very much tied into the story of Har Moriah. God says, I'm going to take you to a makom, I'm going to take you to a place. And that place is a physical place. And often Har Habayit, or the Beit HaMikdash, is called Hamakom, right? Or we call God Hamakom, and he's no place. So the playing around with this idea of place as an emotional entity, or a religious kind of psychological entity, versus a place as real, right? And what do I need to learn about myself and my religion from, quote unquote, either fictional places or psychological places that I'm at versus physical places. Tanakh's playing with that idea all the time, right? And so much of our existence as Jews and as a nationhood is tied to a physical place, right? The return to Jerusalem. And yet one would argue that, you know, so much of our religion is not tied to place at all, right? Like it's about my connection to Shabbat, or the way I learn Torah, or the way I think about God, or I think about faith. So this back and forth between place and not place, right? Or the conversations I hear so many people having now about how much worse their tefillah is because they can't go to shul and minyan, and other people who are like how much better it is, or how nice it is that it can move around to different spaces and it's not tied to a space, you know, I think is Tanakh's playing with that kind of idea all the time. Or the famous Albus Dumbledore quote, right? Of course it is happening inside your head, but why on earth should that mean it is not real? So I think that kind of thinking about utopias and utopian literature and the way they talk about space, and the way our ideal of what a religious space means and what a return to a space means. If you think about the history of Jewish nationhood, how we thrived in exile versus how we thrived in a space, I mean, we're playing with these ideas kind of all the time. And I think it's important to note, tying into these themes, that the Messianic era is not a happily ever after in Tanakh, right? Like the Rambam notes that people will still function with free will, and you may choose to use that free will in a harmful way, as opposed to in Gane Den, when humanity chose to use their free will in a harmful way, they got kicked out, right? Like it's almost like free will and the ability to do negative, corrupt, evil things, or create a society that isn't perfect, doesn't belong in Eden. That's an idealized version of a world. Jerusalem isn't meant to be that way, right? Now, this might be tempered in the Messianic era by additional elements of clarity and seeking and understanding truth. So it's easier to use free will in a productive way, but there will be poor people in the Messianic era. It's just that their lives will be fairer and people will be kinder to them, but it's not like things are going to be about ultimate bliss, right? So utopias are meant to be like, and honestly, even in More's utopia, life is not perfect, right? Utopias are more about how they represent humanity's evolution in community relations than they are supposed to be about ultimate bliss. And I think, you know, again, when you come back to education, I think we sometimes teach kids the idea of Mashiach in terms of ultimate bliss or perfection. But as adults, when we start to learn about what it means to perfect a society, we come to understand that there are ideals of perfection that are set up, and we need to talk about those ideals in order to arrive at certain realities or conclusions or discussions or whatever it is. But just like Jerusalem, the utopian Jerusalem is still a Jerusalem that was and is and exists and is a political entity, so too is the future Jerusalem going to be about that too. So just kind of one final note, which I think is just important to note, the prophetic messianism and the historical messianic movements that it inspired also saw its fair share of suspicion and criticism, right? And messianism and utopianism has justifiably been accused of spinning fantasies in the imaginations of desperate audiences and offering this kind of passive mode of optimism and idealism and empty hope in place of constructive guidance, you know, and advice. And I think, and you know, it's also been observed of utopianism utopian literature as well, that it's, it's at best a fictional enterprise and at worst a subversive, I'm just quoting from a paper about utopian literature, is at worst a subversive avoidance of humanity's current conditions and needs, right? So literary analysts point out that while utopias were tools for social change, they also tended to gloss over current realities. And it's this kind of idea that ideology can be both constructive, but it can also be a negative concept, right? That the adjective utopian is sometimes used in a negative connotation to discredit ideas as too advanced or too optimistic or unrealistic, right? And while there's justifiable basis to a lot of those claims, I think if you really read the descriptions, right, of the messianic vision of Jerusalem next to the descriptions of its destruction and all the words of the Nevi'im that criticized Jerusalem for the ways in which social structures were breaking down and the ways in which people were treating each other, and then you look at its rebuilding, I think you can argue that the prophets weren't losing themselves in wistful dreaming, right? They were accompanying it with hard advice as to what was wrong with society and what we could do to rebuild it, to get it towards a better place. It's our messianism, our utopianism is a national calling and a national expectation. And if that's the case, then of course it needs to be based in space, right? It can't just be like, come on guys, let's do this. Let's fight for, XYZ, philosophical reality. It has to be based in a political, social, national reality. Even if that political, social, national reality had many flaws in it, it has to be based with space. So Eden never comes into the notion of lived space. But Jerusalem, with its flaws, its history, its imperfection, its urban nature that has been very lived in, it is a very lived space. It is the most lived space we can think of on the planet when it comes to who we are, and probably the most lived space for half the other religions in the world also, right? So it sets up a practical reality for growth and progress. That is one that we strive for, imperfections at all. And I think the utopian universe has a lot to thank the world of prophetic messianism for. And what Eden and Jerusalem have in common is that the leaving of it was meant to jumpstart something else. But for Jerusalem, the returning to it is a vital component of our national identity because it is lived space. No one is trying to get back to Eden, right? Or to Gane Den, but we're working kind of to get back to Jerusalem because it's not our priority to reach for an ideal. Right? Like think about that as we're heading into the Yamim Noraim and the Chagim and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. The point is not to reach for perfection. The point is to reach for development of something attainable and tenable in this world, real, actual geographic space that I can't make perfect, but I can make better. And I think that applies on a philosophical level, on an ethical level, personally and nationally, and certainly on a geographical level as well, and without getting political. I don't think our goals are to make Israel perfect. We can always work to make it better. And I think that this idea of space and real space and what space creates in a philosophical way is something that just kind of pervades, it just permeates all of Tanakh's religious, sociological, and ethical discussions. It's all tied up in this idea of space, how flawed space can be, how perfect it can be, and how much we work towards making it more perfect. With that, in our virtual space, thank you all for joining us in this classroom. I hope to see you all in reality and in person later. And I'm totally happy to take any questions or anything that's coming up. And of course, as always, email's still the same, Krupka@Ramaz. I see a few of you here that I will be very disappointed if I don't get an email hi after this. And thank you guys for joining.
Hi, everybody. Miriam, we want to all thank you for inspiring us and setting up such a beautiful way for us to think about Jerusalem as we mourn its destruction and we prepare ourselves for Tisha B'Av. And just before I remind everybody to please, if you have questions, to put it in the Q&A, I'll also remind you that next Thursday, we actually have some very exciting shiurim programs that we will be offering throughout the day of Ramaz alumni and Ramaz current teachers and administrators who will be teaching. Please join us for those shiurim, and please, if you have ideas and thoughts that you want to share with us, please, you're also welcome to do so during that time period, as you always are. If you have any questions for Miriam and want to put them into the Q&A now, we're happy to take them. Or as Miriam told you, she's very happy to take them privately offline at any other time. But once again, we thank everybody for being on with us. We have a question that just came in. And okay, no, that wasn't the question, just a thank you, I think. Someone was saying thank you to you for the wonderful class. They look forward to more. So that's for sure. We all always look forward to Miriam Krupka giving more Torah and more classes. So please, as I say, join us. Miriam, I'm sure, will come back on in the near future to give us more Torah and more thoughts. So with that,
Thanks, Leah.
Thank you. Thanks, Leah Fellner, for all of your work, and thank you all for being on with us this evening. Good night and Shabbat Shalom.